Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington at the end of a very long day that included the Cyber Disrupt Conference. And here is the host of the Cyber Disrupt Conference, none other than Jim Lewis of CSIS, who's one of the nation's leading cyber experts. Jim, how did it go today?
Thank you first for having me on the show. But this was an experiment for us. It's the first time we've done it, and it exceeded our expectations. We, of course, were nervous about the weather, but that worked out. And I think that the thing that started it off for me was Tom Bossert coming and speaking very frankly about what the administration is thinking. He did a great job, and I think a lot of people left feeling like, here's a real pro, here's people who know what they're doing. The president's concern with cybersecurity came across very clearly. So the budget emphasis, they're calling it a skinny budget, but he said that defense and cybersecurity will be plussed up. So overall, a great performance to kick things off by Tom.
One of the things, and to let the audience know, this was really, it was an all-day event, very interdisciplinary. You did have Tom starting it off, and, Fran Townsend did the interviews, right. And he was Fran's deputy once upon a time, right, when Fran was in the Bush administration, obviously. You had Eric Rosenbach here, you had Dmitry Alperovich, you had a very, very innovative and very interesting Romanian company brief on a kind of a unique software set, right, they have. What were some of the key takeaways from you from the conference, not just from Tom, but some other things you heard here over the course of the day, as somebody who knows this stuff and tracks the smaller changes better than almost anybody else?
One of the things that was an experiment here was having individuals come in and give these what we were calling tech talks. And so they were really great when you think about some of the things people said about how we'll improve authentication, the risks from the Internet of Things, a very rich dialogue. For me, the panels were the real highlights, though, because you had just a tremendous cast of characters. You had Jim Miller, the chairman of the Defense Science Board, talking about his report on deterrence. You had Chris Painter, Eric Rosenbach, who else? I can't even remember them all. Just a great set of speakers who pretty much covered the waterfront when it comes to what we're doing on cybersecurity, what we need to do, and a very interactive discussion. So, the thing that struck me is that with very few exceptions, people are more or less in the same place. This is not a partisan issue, and people do feel that there are things we need to do as a government, and one of the changes you might see is a little less emphasis on critical infrastructure protection across the board, a bigger emphasis on a few important companies, a broader emphasis on managed services as a way for the government to deal with this, and an emphasis that the first step is to fix federal networks. So that was good. Some discussion of the NIST framework. I didn't keep score how many times people said NIST, but the sense is the NIST framework is useful. We want to keep doing it. But you need to have metrics, you need to have measurements to figure out what to do.
And for those people, 5 people who are watching this who don't know what NIST is, it's the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, which is sort of the benchmarking standard for cyber, for industry and for government. Let me take you on what your recommendations for the administration would be and put you in a more proactive mode. What are some of the things you think the administration has to focus on? And that's running the gamut, whether it's on a regulatory framework standpoint or all the way to deterrence. You were one of the people who raised kind of the thorny question about what happened with Stuxnet, what happened with the North Koreans, and whether or not that's sending, for example, the kind of deterrent messages that, for example, we would like to be sending. What's your recommendations across the whole cyber waterfront?
The thing that one of the things that surprised me at the conference was that how often deterrence came up, and I don't know why people are fixated with it, but 3 of the panels talked, including the one I was on, talked a lot about deterrence. And I think some of it is the realization that there is no technological solution. We had people from DARPA who talked about over time the technology will get better and eliminate a lot of the lower level risks. But for the high-end attackers, for the high-end threats, we are not going to see a technological solution. So a lot of discussion about how do you expand deterrence, how do you make it work? Is it just military? And I remember that one of the panels talked about how, it was Michael Daniel, The nuclear model of deterrence is just completely wrong for this. So good discussion about how do we link norms, responsible behavior, to consequences if you violate those norms. And I thought that was a useful discussion.
What do you think is going to be the biggest challenge in this new administration as it goes about trying to execute? Each administration, the Obama administration had its challenges. What do you think are going to be the biggest ones for the Trump administration that people already kind of proactively need to start wrapping their heads around?
One thing that only came up a little today is that we will need to have tailored strategies. I think Jim Miller was calling them campaign plans for each different opponent. We won't have a one-size-fits-all strategy. And some of the opponents are really going to be hard to deal with, in particular North Korea. They may not be deterrable. And then what do we do? Iran, apparently not going after the U.S., but very busy in the Gulf. China, interested in some sort of larger international deal. And then the Russians, who are unpredictable at best. So I think the idea that we're going to need different tailored strategies for each opponent that involves legal measures, sanctions, possibly military action, possibly some covert action, that's going to be a challenge for them.
Is it possible to set up some sort of global framework? I can't remember who raised it, right? It was INC, but not just INC. You also raised that, for example, the Russians have destabilized a lot of governments, and potentially ours, depending on what the investigation shows, through not exactly hacking into anybody's computers, right? I mean, there was a portion of that, but a lot of it is through disinformation, propaganda. Is there possible, do you think, to get into some sort of cyber framework where there's almost like a universal disarmament on this?
So the general sense I got from the couple panels that touched on this were a general framework, a broad framework, a global agreement is not going to happen. That's not a possibility. It might be possible to get specific bilateral agreements, say with Russia, on ways to de-escalate, ways to avoid conflict, and the Incidents at Sea agreement from the 80s was used as the model. So the sense I got was, again, tailored to each opponent, may have to have country-specific strategies, but no general global agreement.
We had a few Obama administration officials here. Obviously, cyber was important. Jim Miller, we had an interview with Jim as well. Bill Lynn used to focus a lot, for example, on, he was the first one to have the sort of DoD sort of cyber strategy, even in fact. From your standpoint, what's your verdict on the performance of the Obama administration, and what should the Trump administration continue that the Obama guys started, and what are things that they should definitely change from your standpoint?
We had some real stars here today. So Eric Rosenbach, Jim Miller, Michael Daniel, Chris Painter. These are people who are the architects of cybersecurity in the last 8 years. And one of the things that was interesting to me is that there isn't a blanket rejection of something simply because it came from the Obama administration. And the NIST framework is a good example of something that was an Obama initiative that will be continued in some way. So what I would take from this is every administration wants to take a step back, do a review, study what it needs to do. That will probably come out in the executive order. But when they do that review, they're not starting from ground zero. They are taking a fresh look, but there are things from the legacy that these 4 individuals and many others have done in the last 8 years.
Jim, thanks very much. Thanks very much for hosting us, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Great event. Thank you.